This lecture will be about resource quotas. When a Kubernetes cluster is used by multiple people or teams, resource management becomes more important. You want to be able to manage the resources you give to a person or a team. You don't want one person or one team taking up all the resources, for instance CPU and memory, of the whole cluster. You can divide your cluster in namespaces, which is explained in the next lecture, and enable resource quotas on it, which I will explain now. You can do this using the resource quota and the object quota objects. Each container can specify request capacity and capacity limits, two different things that you can specify. Request capacity is an explicit request for resources. The scheduler can use this request capacity to make decisions on where to put the pods on. You can see it as a minimum amount of resources the pod needs. Resource limit is a limit imposed to the container. The container will not be able to utilize more resources than specified. So this is really a limit where capacity is some kind of minimum amount that you put that Kubernetes can then use to schedule your pod accordingly. Also, request capacity is used by mechanisms like the pod autoscaler, which I explained earlier. Example of resource quotas. You run a deployment with a pod of a CPU resource request of 200M. 200M means 200 milli-CPU, or also 200 millicores. I explained this earlier, I just want to refresh this. It's exactly the same thing as I explained in the autoscaling, it's the same principles. So 200M is 0.2, which is 20% of a CPU core of the running node. If the node has 2 cores, it's still 20% of a single core, and you can also put a limit. For instance, you can put a limit on 400 milli CPU. You can say, I want to have the capacity of 200 milli CPU. Maybe you're going to do some scaling based on that, but the container within this pod can only use a maximum, for instance, of 400 milli CPU. Memory quotas are defined by megabytes or gigabytes. If a capacity quota, for instance memory or CPU, has been specified by the administrator, then each pod needs to specify capacity quota during creation. If you as the administrator is going to say, I want capacity quota on my cluster, then every pod that needs to be scheduled needs to have this capacity quota defined when the pod is created. The administrator can specify default request values for pods that don't specify any values for capacity. You probably want to specify those defaults because otherwise people might just get an error when they don't specify the capacity quota. The same is valid for limit quotas. So what I just explained is for capacity quotas, but also for limit quotas. If you set limit quotas as an administrator, then you better also set default limits. If a resource is requested more than the allowed capacity, the server API, the Kubernetes API server, will give an error for a tree forbidden, and kubecontrol will show an error. The administrator can set the following resource limits within a namespace. You can set a request CPU. This means that the sum of CPU requests of all pods cannot exceed this value. So if you say CPU request is 1 core, then all pods together that are submitted cannot exceed this value. Same with memory. If you say 1 gigabyte max, then the sum of these memory requests cannot exceed this value. Same with the storage. This is about the volume claims. The volume claims cannot exceed this value. And then you have the CPU limits and the memory limits. Same, the sum of the CPU limits of all the pods cannot exceed this value. So people who want to start pods on the cluster will have to specify this limit CPU and limit memory, and the total of these values need to be lower than the total that the administrator is going to set. The administrator can also set the following object limits. You can have limits on config maps, persistent volume claims, pods, replication controllers, resource quotas, services, the load balancers, the node ports, and the secrets. Any limit on those objects, you can say, for instance, I want to have a maximum of 10 pods on a namespace. I want to have, for instance, a maximum of 10 pods within this namespace. So if someone tries to submit an 11th one, then that person will get an error. What exactly namespaces are and how those work, I will explain in the next lecture. And then in the next demo after that lecture, I will show you how to put those limits on a namespace.